experience that to learn you really need to do it. So the structure we're going to use is very much hands-on. So I'll do an initial presentation. This is the part where I actually talk the most, just to give you an overview of what's going on. But then what we'll do is I'm going to start building the chatbot. So do a little bit of the chatbot building part. Then it's your turn. I'm going to give you a URL where you can, there's a website that they're preparing for you, where there are different labs. And so we'll do the first lab, so I'll show you, then you do it. Then I resume showing you the second lab, and you do it, and so on. Until we get to the end where we will have a chatbot that is functional. It might not be a huge chatbot, but it does work, it's useful. And it will be actually deployed on a WordPress site. So we will assign you a site that you can test and play with. And then, of course, you can use the knowledge to build your own, hopefully, and take it from there and learn more from it. Okay, my back and gravity have a long and complicated history, so I'm going to sit as I go through the slides. Okay, so how many of you are familiar with this? You're experiencing higher than normal call volume. Okay, good. I thought it was just me. I was being unlucky. So the idea here is that we hear it from every company, right? No matter who you're calling. And it seems to me that if it's higher than normal all the time, it's just normal, right? So there's another one you might hear very often, which is your call may be recorded, for quality and training purposes. I question how often it's actually used for training purposes, but as you will see today, we will actually use what you would, the conversations that you would have with real customers can be used to train the machine quite well. So you would actually be able to take advantage of those conversations that you recorded. So then you're there, 15 minutes, I'm being optimistic here, maybe more than 15 minutes. And the answer that you get is, have you tried restarting it, right? Now this is frustrating because, if it works, it's frustrating because you realize you spent 20 minutes for something obvious you should have thought yourself. And if it doesn't work, it's frustrating because you waited so long for someone to tell you the obvious, which clearly doesn't solve the problem. So I'm not picking on customer support companies. They do try their best most often. But there is this strip which I really like because it kind of tells you a story about how these things go. So our highest priority is satisfying our customers, except when it's hard or unprofitable or we're busy. But the truth is that companies do try their best. The problem is that providing customer care, it's hard. But it's not hard because the questions that people ask are hard. In most cases, there are some situations where you need to escalate to your brightest in the company to handle the situation. But in most cases, they're very basic questions. They're always the same, depending on which business you are. And the idea is that it's hard because it's hard to scale. So if, let's say you're a company, it's just one-person company, now you're spending most of your time handling customer inquiries instead of focusing on developing your business. But if you're a huge corporation, hopefully your business is doing well and you have many, many customers. There is only so many call centers that you can create, and every time you hire someone, it's an expense, you need to train them and so on. So it's a hard problem to fix. It's something that it's hard to scale. In general, we're not advocating replacing entirely humans at all. There are situations where you need people to handle the more complex inquiries. But for simple queries, we find that chatbots are a great solution. So in fact, we face this problem ourselves. So we launched a site called cognitiveclass.ai, and it's one of those online MOOCs where you can take courses, on data science, artificial intelligence, blockchain, Docker. We're always adding new content. But basically, you go there, you register, you can take courses. And despite not really having a marketing budget for it, because we started it as a community initiative, not as an IBM product, we very quickly had 1 million learners on it, which is great. Very nice problem to have. But it is a problem because when you have 1 million people, you get a lot of questions. And our team is like maybe 15 people, including the interns. And this is not our sole preoccupation. We have many other projects to deal with. So obviously, it's not something that is sustainable on its own. So what we did is we created a very basic chatbot. It's not fancy. It's very essential. You just answer questions about, which courses should I take, the kind of typical questions that students would have. In fact, we call it a student advisor. But despite that, being a basic chatbot, we still found that between 35 and 40% fewer inquiries from students, from our learners. They're not just students. Most are actually professionals. So it was a great success for us because obviously when you cut down on 35–40% of the people asking questions, you gain a lot of hours. At least our team gained a lot of hours to focus on what really matters. Or maybe to provide better care to the people who actually are facing serious problems and not just basic questions, right? Another case I want to highlight is Dollar Tea Club. It's one of those services where you pay a few dollars a month and they send you sample tea by mail. And this is run by one guy, his name is Alan, in Canada. And so the reason why I know about Alan is because he took my course. I created a course, as we'll see later, online on cognitiveClass.ai. And he emailed me and he said, this is amazing. I took your course. I created a chatbot. And he's saving about a quarter of the support hours that he used to dedicate, thanks to the fact that he developed a basic chatbot on his own. And he's not a programmer, he's a business user. And here's the thing, Alan is the kind of guy this is truly a one-man shop. Like, he does everything. He's like in his living room putting labels and shipping the tea. I suspect he might actually plan the tea as well. But the idea is he does everything. So for him it was life-changing to get several hours back and handle the basic stuff, because a service like this, typically people ask very simple questions like, is it shipping free? Do you deliver to my country? How much is it per month? Can I order 2 packages instead of 1? The usual stuff. And the chatbot has no problem answering those kind of questions. These are just some quotes to inspire us. But the idea is that everyone seems to think that by 2020 we will all have chatbots. The idea is that we will all interact with chatbots as far as customer care interactions go. I must say, these quotes came from a few years ago. And when I first put this type of quotes on my slides and I started talking about chatbots, I was like, okay, maybe yes, maybe no. But now I'm starting to see it. They might have been onto something with these quotes, because with these predictions, because I start to see chatbots more and more in the wild. So what's a chatbot anyway? Right? So we can give it a formal definition. So a chatbot is some kind of automated software that is able to have a conversation with a user through some kind of chat interface. Now, when you think of chat interface, you might think some kind of maybe messaging app or maybe text. And that's certainly one way, and perhaps even the most popular way. But text is not the only way. There's also audio. For example, if you use one of those smart assistants at home, like Amazon Echo through Alexa, or maybe you have a Google Home, or any of those, even just Siri on your phone. Those are all examples of essentially a chatbot, some software that can automatically have a useful conversation with you, and you do it through audio typically rather than text. So either text or audio is fine. So when people refer to chatbots, sometimes you'll hear them say bot instead of chatbot, or even robot. That's fine. It's colloquial, but it's important to understand that bot is more of a kind of a superset of chatbots. It's a more general term because what makes a chatbot is the conversational element. So the bot part is the automated part, but the conversation is very important. If there is no conversation, it's just a bot. For example, you could create a trading bot that monitors the stock market for conditions to change and then maybe with some certain conditions are right, it will make a purchase order. That's great, but it's not a chatbot because there's no conversation taking place. So other names that you might find used out there are virtual assistant, chatterbots, artificial conversational entities or ACE, and talkbots. A lot of these names were developed where the field was still in its very beginning. So the people got creative with names, but the idea is that most often you'll hear the terms chatbots and virtual assistants. Now, virtual assistant is a little bit ambiguous because there are also human virtual assistants over the internet providing this service to companies. But in general, I would say chatbot and virtual assistant are the most common. So why are we all of a sudden able to create these chatbots, talk about them, and see them more and more? And I think there are a couple of reasons why. The first factor I would say is that messaging apps are extremely popular. They really emerged even above and beyond social media. You know, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, WeChat, all of those platforms, they're extremely popular. Like, they're more popular than Facebook, Twitter, and so on. So that kind of makes the user really at ease when it comes to communicating through text, interacting through text. And if you're familiar with, if you know any millennials, some of you might be millennials, I don't want to judge your age, but if you're familiar with millennials, they're kind of scared of talking on the phone. They're like, why are you calling me? Who died, right? It's all about text or sending messages. So it's a very convenient way of communicating. So you want to go where the users are, right? So if your users are comfortable with that way of communicating, it's a great way to do that. The second factor I would say is even bigger is that artificial intelligence is becoming smarter. So now we have the technical capability of actually creating these chatbots. Because without the artificial intelligence element, we would develop chatbots that are not very smart and therefore not very useful to the user. So you might be familiar with a game of Jeopardy in the United States. At some point, IBM challenged the best players in the world with Watson. And spoiler alert, we won. So the idea is that here is not a game. At some point in the early days of artificial intelligence, we had Deep Blue, which defeated Kasparov in a game of chess. And it was impressive, but the game of chess is still fundamentally a set of rules, somewhat mathematical. The English language, it's much harder because it's so flexible. And the game of Jeopardy, sometimes even for a human, it's kind of hard to know what they're asking. So the fact that Watson was able to participate and actually compete and win showcased the ability. It's a linguistic ability, it's understanding of the human language, specifically English. So by the end of today, you will all fully understand these formulas. Not really. The beauty of it is that artificial intelligence is definitely getting smarter, and there are people with PhDs working on those kind of formulas. But the real life changer for us is that artificial intelligence is becoming more available. So it's not just we have smarter artificial intelligence, it's also more accessible to developers, but also to people who have an understanding of the business side of things and perhaps not of the coding side of things. As we'll see today, we'll definitely be able to accomplish a lot without writing any code whatsoever. So this is a snapshot of the IBM Cloud catalog, which is a service in the cloud, of course, where a lot of these artificial intelligence functionalities are exposed and made available for developer and non-developer to use. Some of these services will do translation, sentiment analysis, understanding of the personality of the writer just by copying and pasting in some text, those kind of functions. Some very, very useful business applications as well. But of course, today we're going to focus on Watson Assistant because it's the primary service that one would use to create chatbots. To further prove the fact that it's a little bit anecdotal, but to prove that chatbots are starting to appear left and right. I flew in from Canada via New Zealand, so I flew with Air New Zealand. And I was on the plane, I was asking questions, and I wasn't getting many answers. But thankfully they had Wi-Fi, so I went on their site. Didn't find that much information on their site, but their chatbot is really, really good. The name is Oscar. And I was able to ask about protein powder and protein bars. I wasn't sure, like, when you arrive, they give you an arrival card that is scary. Like, they make it sound like you're a criminal because you brought protein bars. So I wasn't sure, so I just kept asking questions, and I got all the answers. Like, you know, the flight attendants had no clue really, but they were nice, but they didn't know. But Oscar knew all the answers. Another example, again from New Zealand, but so this is Vi. It's made by a company called FaceMe, and the idea is that you're essentially using a chatbot, but in this case you see a person that talks to you. And so you interact naturally, like as you would. It's like a virtual person. So she's not just a creepy face. I mean, a slightly unsettling face. Behind it, it actually uses Watson technology, which is the same technology that you will use today. Of course, their technology is really good. What they built on top, because you know they make the lip sync work well. You know, you see the face moving naturally and all of that. But the idea is that most of what the useful part of it, which is the actual answers, will be built with IBM technology, and it's going to be the same network technology that you use today and you'll become knowledgeable about today. So as we mentioned, it's not just companies that are huge that can take advantage. It's one person shop or all the way to very large corporations. One case I like to mention is the case of an hotel. You check in an hotel, you may have lots of questions. What time is breakfast? Is breakfast included? What are the pool hours? Gym hours? All that, those kind of questions. Very simple stuff. And so instead of having your reception busy answering those kind of questions, you can have a chatbot reply to all these questions, and then have your reception deal with the more complex queries. One time I was traveling, very nice hotel, but they had crickets in my room. So I don't expect the chatbot to be able to handle that. But I do appreciate when I go to reception and they're free, because they're not dealing with the same questions over and over, to handle something that clearly needs to be handled by someone, a person, not a chatbot. So how does the chatbot work? Actually, it's very easy. The user enters in inputs, it thinks really hard, and you get the response. But that's not very detailed, so let's try to zoom in on what that thinks really hard means. So there are three main components. It's intents, entities, and dialogue. Now, intents are, I would argue, the most important part. So intents try to capture what the user wants. If you have a human customer care agent, their biggest skill is empathy towards the customer, of course, but essentially the ability to understand what the customer is asking, ultimately. So we use intents to capture the user goal. What is the reason for them asking the question? So whenever you create a chatbot, you want to start with defining the intents. If you define the intents right, everything else tends to falls into place, as you'll see in a moment. So to give you a little bit more of a practical example, we could say, well, let's create a greetings intent. So we're telling Watson, look, Watson, there is this thing that we humans do. It's called greetings. Okay, so anytime you see something that looks like an hello, hi, hey, good morning, kia ora, or something like that, that's a greeting. So we pass these examples to Watson, and Watson will start training on them. So even though Watson has an understanding on the English language thanks to a lot of sources that were used to train it. So even though the user might not use one of these greetings, if it looks like a greeting, Watson will be able to detect that that's the case. You want to have 5 examples or more. More is better, of course, the more the merrier. But for something as simple as greetings, 5 examples is plenty. For more complex queries that the user might ask, having 10, 15, 20 examples is great. But 5 is the minimum, recommended minimum. So When the user then asks for a question of any kind to the chatbot, Watson will go through the list of all the intents that we define and say, okay, is there anything that looks like what the user just asked? So is there anything that looks like a greeting? Is there anything that looks like a goodbye? Is there anything that looks like a question, that whatever intents we defined for the chatbot? So when the user comes along, she says aloha. Well, even though it wasn't an example, Watson will know, yeah, that's a greeting, because it's international enough as a word that, to represent a greeting. Intents cannot have a space in them. So if you want to give it a space to kind of create an intent that is a little more meaningful rather than just one word, like in the case of greetings, you'll want to use an underscore or something like that to separate it. We are speaking about chatbots built in English, of course, but other languages, as we'll see in a second, are supported as well. So if your customers are in a different geography and you want to build your chatbot in, I don't know, Chinese, French, Japanese, you can do so. So that's for intents. The second component is entities. So we use entity to capture a very specific value. So the intent tells us, okay, what does the user want? Entities tell us what specifics did the customer pass in their request. So to give you an idea, we could define the concept of location, so that would be our entity. And then we can define some location values. So we could say Sydney, Melbourne, Auckland. Maybe this is for a chatbot. As we'll see in the demo, we'll build a chatbot for a fictitious flower shop that has different retail locations in New Zealand and Canada, in Australia. And as you can see here, there's also the ability to specify synonyms, because customers might not say, in this case, Auckland. They might go by Queen City. I don't know how common that is to call Auckland Queen City, but the idea is that by providing synonyms, you also capture when the user uses a different way of phrasing the same specific concept. So a synonym is not necessarily a dictionary synonym, though it could be. It can just be something that represents the same concept. So if you have a branch, let's say you're a bank and you have a branch downtown in Sydney, and everyone just calls it the downtown branch, you could have downtown as a synonym for the Sydney location. Entity values can have spaces and even apostrophes, but they need to have parentheses to be captured. So basically, when you use the, as we'll see in the chatbot, when you refer to them, you have to refer to them with the parentheses. Just a little note or something that you might have to do. It's not too common to have spaces in entity values, but it's possible. It may happen. So now, when the user asks, what's the address of your Sydney store, we can capture the intent. Let's say we defined a location info intent. So Watson will know what's the intent of the user. They want to know an address. But also the specifics of it, because we defined a location entity. And the specifics here are location Sydney. So we know that they want the Sydney location. And that brings us to the third component, which is the dialogue. Because now that we know what's the intent, we know the specifics of what they want, we can create a response that is very custom tailored to them. We can tell them the exact address of the location that they're inquiring about. So a dialogue is typically a list of nodes, and each node will handle one particular scenario. So in this case, you can see the structure of an empty node. You would have a name. There's just a label that you use. Then there's a condition that pretty much determines when this node is executed. The condition could be, for example, the intent. Let's say this is for a greeting. We check for the intent that is greeting, and then in the response section, we might respond back, hello there. Now, this feels a little more theoretical, if you will, but you're going to do all of this in practice very soon. So don't worry if you don't get all the details here. You will, very much so, in a moment. The response can also be a little more complex. I mean, it can have multiple responses that attach a condition to each response. So then we say, well, if it's Oakland, this is the response for the address. If it's Wellington, this is the address. If it's Sydney, this is the address, and so on. As I say, the dialog is a list of nodes, and the way how it works is it will start evaluating the user input, whatever the user asked, at the very top, so the first node, and it's going to say, well, does this node, the condition of this node, apply to what the user asked? If so, that's it. We execute it, we give the response, and we're good. But if not, we keep going. So we keep going while the condition is false, and we stop the first time one node satisfies the condition, and therefore we can execute it and give back the response to the user. Whenever you develop a chatbot, you want to consider positioning, tone, and personality. So you want to give the chatbot a little bit of personality, maybe even give it a name, because people tend to ascribe human-like characteristics to almost a human personality to inanimate objects whenever they have any minimal resemblance to human behavior. So if you make your chatbot human-like, people will start to feel like almost they are interacting with a person. It's also important to consider what is the purpose of the chatbot. Are you building this for customer support? Are you building it for prospective clients, so maybe more of a sales or marketing role? So it's important to be clear about what are the expectations for your chatbot. It's also important to define the tone of what kind of chatbot do you want. If your crowd, your users are mostly kids, you want slang, whatever. If this is for a funeral home, you probably don't want to have funny emojis and crack jokes with the customer, right? So just adjust the tone accordingly to what kind of users you have. It's also important to kind of define the scope of your chatbot. A lot of people think, well, I'm going to make a chatbot, I'm going to start off the bat and say, how can I help you, or ask me anything. That's not a good idea, because the chatbot will not be able to handle. Yes, AI got smarter, but not that smart. We can't handle everything, because the chatbot simply doesn't know about all the details of your business, or is not able to answer any random question that a person might have. So you want to kind of guide the user a little bit, and we'll see in practice how to do that with our prompt to the user. But in general, you want to, when you define a chatbot, it's better to have a small chatbot that does a few things well than a chatbot that tries to do everything and it doesn't really provide good answers back to the user. 3 quick rules when defining a chatbot. The first one is not to use yes and no answers. As you define responses, it's very tempting to use yes or no in the answer. So, for example, let's say you define a delivery info intent, and so you expect the customer to ask, is delivery free? So it's very tempting to say, yes, it is. The problem is that when the customer expresses the same intent, but they do so in a different way, they might say, do I have to pay for deliveries? And your response is going to be, yes, it is, which doesn't make sense. Or it comes across as very robotic or something that is not very human-like. It's not a proper conversation. So a better way, instead of saying yes, it is, or no, it's not, is to say something like deliveries are free. Because now if people are saying, is delivery free, it still answers the question. If they say, do I have to pay for deliveries, it still answers the question. So regardless of what they ask, as long as they're asking about deliveries, which you capture through the intent, the response will work. And this kind of leads us to the second point. It's good to incorporate part of the user question in the response, because you don't want, it kind of helps make the customer feel like the chatbot is understanding them. Because when you reincorporate in the answer portion, like we did here, by saying deliveries are free, the customer will feel like, okay, the chatbot is kind of getting me, even though you're giving the same, essentially the same answer, but incorporating is a good practice. And the third one is to provide succinct and accurate answers. You don't want to provide a wall of text, 2,000 words, like you don't want an essay in your response. No one is going to read that. 2-3 sentences at most. If you do have a lot of information, let's say customer is asking about how to apply for a credit card, and you do have to provide a lot of information to do that, link to it. So you would have responses say you can find more information about our application process on this page on our site, and you would link that particular page that is relevant. So you're still answering the question, you're still helping the customer, but you're not giving them a 2,000 word essay to read in a little chat window. Okay, so with that said, we can get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a link to the hands-on lab, and the first thing you do is the first lab. But before you do it, I want to show you what's going to happen during this lab. Okay, so first I'm going to show you what it looks like. So this is the site. So you can read the introduction and you will be doing the first lab. So the first task that you will do is register with IBM Cloud. Now, I know a lot of you did it already, which is great. If you didn't, it might be helpful to do it maybe with your phone or maybe tethered to your phone. Because what happens is that if a lot of people do it from the same IP, the system thinks it's an attack or it's fake registrations, and it might block you. Either way, make sure you have an IBM Cloud account by clicking this button to register if you haven't done so already. The next step is creating a Watson Assistant instance. I'm going to show you what it looks like. So basically, I'm just going to log in since I already registered. So I'm just going to put my credentials in. And once I'm logged in, I'm basically seeing a dashboard of all my resources. And in my case, it's a brand new account, so there shouldn't be any resources in there. So I'll just see an empty page essentially. But if you add other resources, chatbots or other services, they will all be listed here. And I have the option to create a resource, so I'm going to create that. By the way, you don't have to do it at the same time. You can just pay attention to me. You'll be doing it during the lab. I can search for it here, but I'm just going to go to the AI section and select. When I do that, I'm presented with a page where I can create the service. Finding a data center for me, and I believe most of the development team will, if you select US South as it is, you probably want to select Sydney. Excellent. So once you're done, or you got Watson Assistant, Flower, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. It's for you to recognize. It matters more when you have many services, because then it gets confusing. But in this case, you're going to have one, so it's fine to leave as a default. You also have the option to select the plan. So the light plan is the default. It's free. You get up to 10,000 API calls per month. Now, an API call is essentially the customer asked one question and the chatbot responded. So you can get up to 10,000 of those per month for free on this plan. You will join as part of this lab the site candidateclass.ai. So you will also get an offer there to receive the equivalent of about $200 US in cloud services, which you can apply to your account. And then if you apply that and you use it solely for Watson Assistant, you get more like maybe 80,000 API calls for the first 6 months instead of 10,000. So it's a good offer. You can take advantage of it if you want. But I mean, depending on how popular is your chatbot with your customers, a lot of people find even 10,000 is enough. They don't end up having to pay. If you do decide to pay because you have a very popular client base and you put it on a site that is very popular, then the standard plan where you pay as you go is an option. The cost is not that expensive. It comes down to about $2.50 US per 1,000 calls. So it's not big numbers. Of course, if you have 100 million requests, the price goes up. But at that point, you're obviously serving your business needs quite well with the chatbot if you have so many people interacting with it. So basically, during the lab, you will do the same as I did. You will select Sydney. You will create your instance. And so that's the second task, which is creating the Watson Assistant. I will ask you to bookmark a few pages so that you can quickly go back to it. You can always end up back here through the IBM.com site, but if you bookmark when I tell you on the labs, it's much better because you kind of can get a little bit lost. IBM.com is a big site, so bookmarking is the way to go. Just want to show you that once I created the service here, I can also, I just created a service, but it doesn't mean that I'm doing anything yet. So I want to launch the tool, which is a user interface where I can work with the chatbot. And once I launch it, I will be sent on a page where there's a bunch of information, videos and stuff like that. You're welcome to read them and watch them in your own time at home. But today we're going to focus on the actual meat of the chatbot building part, which is the workspaces area. And so then, as I mentioned earlier, you will enroll in CandidateClass.ai, specifically in the course that I made. Not because you're going to take the course, you're getting the in-person version, which is more in-depth, better, more interactive. And the course was built a few months ago, so it's not quite, in terms of UI and videos that were recorded, it's going to look a little bit different than the live UI, so you get the better version for sure. But still, it would be good for you to enroll because for the quizzes and the final exam, and that way you will be able to get a certificate of completion and also a badge. It's backed by IBM, which attests that you know how to build chatbots. It's one of those fancy badges where you can click on it and it will send you on a site that verifies that it's you are the person who actually passed the course. You can then embed that into your LinkedIn, resumes, whatever you like. Brag on social media, whatever you prefer. Again, as I mentioned, you might also want to get that offer where you get cloud services if you want. And you'll need it also because throughout the process of creation, we'll also deploy the chatbot on a site and a WordPress site specifically. And I don't expect every one of you to already have a WordPress site. So the course has a section where you'll be able to generate a site for you, and we'll use that in the labs later. And then finally, you start taking your first quiz. It's from the first module of the course, so it's a very generic. You're going to get the kind of questions that we sort of discussed in the presentation. You shouldn't have any trouble with this particular quiz. It should be fairly easy. Now, this is hard to read the URL, so I created a slide that makes it a little bit easier for you. So now it's your turn. Otherwise, this is the URL. Okay. Okay, that's not very helpful. Let's see if it takes a moment or... Okay. No, we're not going to go full screen. Okay. For some reason, the full screen doesn't work, but I think you can see it anyway. It has to do. Good thing I didn't write any compromising notes at the bottom because you can see them. Okay, that's URL. Let me know if you have trouble getting to it. Test. Okay. Seems to work. Okay. Vitamin interference. Okay, I think we'll do without the microphone. It creates some sort of interference. It's annoying. This one is recorded now. So no, stop. I don't think it's recording now. Maybe. Okay. Jared said that he's thinking or something, but it's not. He said it's half an hour ago, so I don't know.
Just on the instructions,
Yes.
Is it saying that we have to sign up for the Cognitive Plus account?
Yeah, so basically what you wrote there.
Yeah, because here it says you don't need to sign up. It's free, and then here it says you need to sign up. So I'm just wondering, so just this you don't need to do?
You don't need to take the course, but you want to enroll in it. So you'll click here, and then you would select the free course, and then you would register it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
but
this you have to do.
So yeah, basically don't take the course, but do sign in, enroll, so that you can do all the other stuff that you need. Like I'm gonna give an example of once I log in there, I will see the course. view course. So click there, and then edit the course button.
Okay.
So that way I got access to the quiz, I got access later to the site.
Thank you.
By show of hands, how many people completed the quiz already? You can give it a few more minutes. Hopefully after this we'll also have refreshments.
If I got the answer, you come back, I guess.
Okay. I'm not sure because it's the Australian office network. I know it's IBM Internet, but you need to register. Would you be able to tether just while we sort it out, just with your phone for a moment? But we'll definitely want to get you set up. Good. So we have one gentleman.
Yes.
You just arrived, it's out for the internet.
Great. Okay. Guys, if I could have your attention for a second as well. I'm just going to put in a coffee order. Probably the best way to go about it is to email me and just with what you want. So the email is Jared SW, that's JARRAD SW. Yeah.
The bot of the order.
I should have done that right. Should be prepared enough to set it up myself. That's a tip for next time. So sorry, JARRAD one.ibm.com. Yeah, sorry. Let me know if you can get that.
But again, hands-off keyboard as usual. Just pay attention, and the lab will give you step-by-step instructions. So as you'll see, I'm inside the workspaces. I'm inside the workspaces area, and this is where you would create your chatbots. You could create a chatbot that is complex and
This is multiple workspaces, but in general, you can think of one workspace is one chatbot, because a workspace is a collection of intents, entities,